welcome to those of you who are with us live this morning. I have a very simple objective this morning, and that is I want to improve your lives and make your careers more successful. So I've got 45 minutes to do that in, but that's the simple goal I have. In order to do that, I have to leave you with three things to understand if you don't already. And it's all in the service of making the best use or better use of your brain as a resource. And in order to do that, I need to help you become a brain smart executive. That is, you need to understand a little bit about how the brain functions. And then from an action standpoint, I want you to install your own, what we call CBO, which is Chief Brain Officer. You might ask the question, why the brain? What has that got to do with leadership? That's based on a study we did. We found out that most leaders have brains. Not all of them have brains, but most of them do. But more seriously, when we look at the failure of leaders and the failure of managers, that is, if you look at the behavior that led them to be ineffective, we find that most of it has to do with how the brain functions, and basically the bad parts of their brain were doing things that got them in trouble from a management standpoint or leadership standpoint. In order to get to the first learning, I want to go to a cultural meme that we've all heard throughout our life. And it starts with the words, count to 10 before you. And then my question has to do, before you do what? So all of you have heard this meme, count to 10 before you do. And now I want you to finish that in your brain before I tell you the end of that. So what the meme says is count to 10 before you do something you will later regret. The interesting thing in that cultural advice is that there's two yous. So it says, count to 10 before you, so that's one version of you, do something that apparently a different version of you will later regret. So if you think about that, it's suggesting through something we say to each other all the time that there must be two yous. And for our convenience this morning, we could label them U1 and U2. The U1 is apparently an entity in your brain that does something first. And then U2 is an entity in your brain that thinks about it and regrets it later. So the source of U1 down at the bottom of the slide are things like feelings, emotions, values, beliefs, impulses, first reactions, habits. And the working parts of U2 are things like critical thinking, analytical thinking, problem solving, reflecting, thinking through downstream consequences and reasoning. So the question you would have to ask yourself is why would U1 do something that U2 knows will have a negative downstream impact on you? It's going to do you some damage. Theoretically, you could lose your job, you could lose your career, you could lose a relationship by something this mysterious U1 does, that if U2 had been under control, you wouldn't have done that. We have several other sayings that say the same thing. So somebody does something, they hit their boss in a meeting, and you're counseling and coaching with them after the fact, and they say, well, why did you hit your boss? And they say, well, I just lost my mind. Well, what they're saying is U2 wasn't under operation, or I wasn't thinking, or I lost my head. Or they'll say, it got the better of me. So I ask a question as a coach, what's it? Well, it was U1, because U1 controlled your behavior at that moment. Or they say, I don't know what I was thinking. Well, that's exactly true because you did something pretty dumb. And U1 tends to do dumb things. Or I got carried away. Which part of I got carried away? Well, my U1 determined the action or the thing I said in that meeting, not U2. We also think of that in another way, that is, people in a conversation or a debate will say something like, let me think on that for a while, saying, give me a second because I don't want my U1 to dictate the response I'm going to give to you. So that's an interesting question. That's an interesting criticism. That's an interesting statement of an issue and a problem. But before I respond to you, give me a second. I want to bring you two on stream, apply analytical and critical thinking. And when I do that, I'll give you my response. Now that may be 2 seconds later. It may be a minute later, it may be tomorrow. But people say, I need to go think on that. People actually say, after having done a U1 bad event and rethinking it with U2, my brain has a mind of its own. Well, that's exactly true. Your brain, parts of your brain are fully capable of operating without awareness. And we'll talk about a little bit about that. So we know it actually has at least two minds, U1 and U2, and we'll give more detail on that as we go forward. The other way to think about this is a couple interesting things. I think all of you have had the experience where you solved a problem overnight. That is, you went to bed thinking about a particular issue that you're facing or a problem you need to solve. And you actually wake up with the answer. I say, well, who did that? You're asleep. You're basically under anesthesia. So who exactly worked on that problem overnight? It's the same thing as dreaming. You have a dream machine that runs evening dreaming, and you're generally unaware of what it's going to do each night, whether it's going to be a happy dream or a nightmare. But it basically works on it on its own. There's also the aha or the eureka phenomena, and what the functional MRI work on the brain has shown is that when your brain solves a problem, the brain has an aha experience before you're aware that it's been solved. And it's about a half of a second delay. So your brain by itself realizes that it has just solved a major issue or a problem. And only half a second later does it come into awareness where you say aha or eureka. We have the same thing where somebody will say to you, I could do that if I just put my mind to it. Well, which mind are they talking about? They're talking about the U2 mind. We have another thing that we hear frequently, that cooler heads prevail. Well, what does that mean, cooler heads prevail? That means that U1 had less of an influence and U2 came on stream. And the issue was settled by critical analysis and thinking and analysis of pros and cons rather than beliefs or values or emotions or feelings. We've seen this in a pictorial that we've all seen coming from some great artwork. And it's usually depicted in a religious way. That is, on one shoulder, you've got the devil whispering in one ear, and you've got your guardian angel whispering in the other ear. That's similar to what I'm talking about. That is, there are two voices that you have inside, U1 and U2. And we'll talk more about that. Another way to look at this phenomena is when you consider the unfortunate situation of addiction, addiction of any kind. In the study of addiction, which is useful into studying this split between the U1 and the U2 brain, There is a checklist of 10 criteria to label that a person has become addicted to shopping or gambling or substance abuse or whatever it is. That is, you spend inordinate amount of time doing this thing. You become dependent on it. And number two, even though the behavior becomes harmful, either physically or mentally, you continue to do it. You can't stop even when you want to. You begin to neglect other areas of your life pursuing this addictive quality that you're looking for. You begin to experience withdrawal when you don't get it. All of that being true, number 7, you deny you have the problem. Number 8, your own personal addictive behavior begins to harm other people around you. You have to do it more to get the same highs as when you started. And you generally relapse when you try. Now, when you look at that list, I'm astounded by number 4. So number 4 says you can't stop or cut back when you want to. Well, which you wants to stop, do you think? Do you think it's you 1 or you 2? It's you 2 that wants to stop. So if you look at that phenomena, that number 4, it says you can't stop or cut back even when you want to. That means that you 1 has overpowered you 2. I'm addicted myself to the reality program, My 600-Pound Life. And if you've ever watched it, and I recommend that you do to study what happens in the brain, you have 600-pound people that come to Dr. Now in Houston. And they have a first session, and they all come in sometimes by gurney or wheelchair or whatever. They have a horrible life. And they come to Dr. Now, who's a bariatric surgeon, asking for help. And he always starts by saying, "What are you here for?" "I need help." "What do you need help for?" "I'm too heavy. It's affecting my life. My doctor said I'm going to die. I have children. I have a spouse. I have grandchildren. I want to live, and I can't leave my house. I can't leave my room. It's just horrible." And Dr. Now says, "What is the problem?" "I eat too much." Then you are in the right place. As a medical doctor, I'm telling you, don't eat so much. That will then solve your problem. You will begin to lose weight as soon as you don't eat so much. Well, the reason they're there is they can't do that. The reason they need bariatric surgery to trim their stomach down by 80%, they are unable to overcome the U1 craving urge to eat. So all people who are addicted to anything, U1 has overpowered U2. Now, for the most part, they could give a presentation on nutrition. There has been no one on the program that does not know the eating solution. What they do not have a solution to is overpowering U1. So in thinking through U1 and U2, U1 is compulsion, it's locked in, it's automatic, it's habituated, it's obsessed, it's emotionally driven. U2 is choice, free will, and critical thinking. So I want you to think about that distinction as we go through. And that's the first lesson for you to become more brain smart, is you actually have 2 brains. Now, for the 2 neurologists that are watching us this morning, we appreciate that in autopsy, there's not 2 parts of your brain, one blue and one yellow. U1 and U2 are not names of parts. It's just a teaching metaphor on how the brain operates. This same system of a double brain is all over the literature. For the most part, it's called fast and slow thinking, system 1 and system 2, lower and upper, automatic and controlled, emotional and rational, unconscious and conscious. I just happen to call that U1, U2, so it's quite typical of brain communicators and educators to use that distinction. And it actually goes back to Freud. So if you think of the devil and angel on your shoulders, really what he's talking about is the id, the ego, and the superego. So it goes back well into the history of philosophy and thinking. And Freud popularized the id, which is the unconscious bad stuff that makes you do things. Ego, which is basically your awareness. It's what you're aware that you're doing. And then the superego in that system is a values-driven guardian angel telling you what the good and the bad things are that you're trying to do. So the first learning is that your brain operates in 2 modes. And if you can think about that and hold that as a mind frame, then I want to load some brain knowledge. There's sort of a new field in the last decade called neuro leadership. And all of the studies have to do with the impact of how the brain functions on the quality of management and leadership. I don't want to read the slides, so I'm going to give you 30 seconds to read this yourself, those of you who are staring at your screen. So we're sort of in the decade of the brain, and we're beginning through primarily functional MRI research to be able to look at what the brain is doing while we're either doing things good or doing things badly. And the major issue is, can we change it? That is, we're also beginning to learn how we can make or help people change what they're doing by making more effective use of their brain resources. So in the time allotted, I just want to bring you up to speed on 5 areas of brain research that relates to installing a chief brain officer in your own mental system. So I want to talk a little bit about brain design, neuroplasticity, working memory, automaticity, and mindfulness. The first issue is brain design. So what's the brain designed to do? What's its function? What does it do and why does it do what it does? And are you your brain? And I want to take a look at a couple quotes by David Rock on the function of the brain. And again, I'll let you read this rather than read the screen. So take 30 seconds and scan this. So David, who is sort of the founder and leader of the neuro leadership movement, basically says that your ability to regulate emotions, and in his world, that's U1, instead of being at the mercy of them, is central to being more brain effective. And then his second quote that I'll let you scan, give you another 30 seconds. So his key thought is that the brain is designed primarily to be the runner of the biological system. Later on, as most of you know, the prefrontal cortex, which designed and evolved last, is for art and music and wonderful sunsets and all sorts of altruistic activities. That was the last part of the brain to come on stream. So if you look at the question of brain design, what it means is that for the most part, the brain is designed to seek pleasure, to avoid threat and pain, which brings on the fight or flight response. And it's designed to protect the box it comes in because it has a need to procreate and continue to create other humans. And so the whole brain, the lower brain and the midbrain, are designed to protect and run the biological systems that keep you alive and healthy. It's only the third part of the brain, the upper brain, the prefrontal cortex, which is analytical and critical thinking and reflection and wisdom and experience. The brain's major purpose is to scan for threat. And it does that. One of the pieces of the brain is called the insula. And it scans your environment constantly for threat. It has a 4-to-1 negative to positive bias. It is designed to find things that are threatening. You can imagine that in very early times, it was looking for saber-toothed tigers and dangerous snakes and dangerous people from the valley next to us. In civilized society of today, one of the problems you have with this threat monitor is that your boss is threatening. Your colleagues are threatening. Your mortgage and car payments are threatening. So the brain has a lot of threat that it looks at. When it detects threat, it kicks off the so-called fight or flight mechanism. If you're walking in the woods and you come across what your brain reads as a potential snake, you have your choice to fight the snake or to turn around and get out of the area. And that's what the brain runs, is the fight or flight system. The threat brain is about 50% accurate. That is, lots of the threat that the brain is reading is not in fact a threat. So we over-respond with anxiety and stress to half of the things that are not in fact stressful, shouldn't be stressful. So we have a lot of worry going on, a lot of stress and anxiety based on the fact that the U1 brain overreads negative things in your environment. If the U1 brain detects a snake, it makes that decision by itself. It is not something that happens in awareness. As a courtesy to your upper brain, it also sends the signals to your prefrontal cortex. And half of a second later, your prefrontal cortex will scan that same area and figure out that it's a stick. But even in that case, it takes about 45 seconds to 60 seconds to overcome what the U1 brain has already started in the fight or flight response. So that's the brain design. It's primarily an organ to protect. And U1 is its mechanism for doing that. Neuroplasticity is an interesting set of findings because probably up until a couple decades ago, we thought that the brain is the brain. You have what you got. Once it develops and finishes developing around the early 20s, it pretty much stays that way. It doesn't change over time. We now know that that's not true. We now have abundance, ample evidence that the brain changes on a daily basis. Cells die, new cells get put in. We also are beginning to realize that you can change your wetware, and your wetware is the software in the brain. It's the programs that run your brain. So there's wetware, software. And we're beginning to understand that you can reprogram the relationship between U1 and U2. You can strengthen U2's ability to override the negative aspects of U1. So neuroplasticity is real. Therapy is based on neuroplasticity. And it's a burgeoning field of figuring out how to help people change their internal programming for both life, happiness, and career success. And that's basically what we're talking about. An example of that is what we used to call optimism. It's now called growth mindset. And Carol Dweck has done significant work in growth mindset. And growth mindset says that mindsets can change your thinking and therefore change your behavior and therefore change outcomes. Growth mindset means that you have a positive, optimistic viewpoint that things will work, that I can be successful, I can control my own destiny by better thinking and better use of my intellectual resources. It's like what we all had in childhood, the little engine that could. So I think I can, if you remember that being read to you in childhood. The little train's not sure they can make it up the hill. So the little train used growth mindset to do it and kept saying, I think I can, and finally got to the top of the hill and said, I can't, I did it. Carol Dweck has done lots of experiments with two groups of people doing a challenging task of some sort. And the experimental manipulation is, I tell the first group, unlikely that you're going to be able to do this, do your best, but it's not very likely you're going to do well. And then in the other room, they tell the other group, this is going to be easy for you. We know all of you. You're all bright and smart. This is going to be a walk in the park, so just relax and do your best. And then they do the test or whatever it is. And then they look at the comparison of the two groups who are otherwise equal. But what happens is the group with the positive mindset outperforms the group with the negative mindset. So that's the basic theory under growth mindset. I think I can actually makes a difference in how your brain operates. The third thing I want to teach you about how the brain works is working memory, which is an interesting design feature of the brain. The hourglass sort of shows what that system is. We have an infinite world outside. We have trillions of pixels available to smell and sense and feel and listen to. We have a supercomputer in your brain. It's talked about as the most fascinating machine in the universe that we know of. It's so complex that we're never going to be able to figure it out. No computer or artificial intelligence is ever going to be able to duplicate what the brain does. And the funny thing about the design of that system is the middle of the hourglass, which is working memory. And it's called a choke point because it turns out that people have about 4 to 7 channels of information, communication, and transmission available in the brain. It differs person to person. So at the high end, there are some people with 7 independent channels. On the low end, there might be people with 4 independent channels. And the supercomputer, your brain, can be only as effective as the amount and the quality of information from the outside world that comes into the supercomputer. Now, the interesting thing about how that works, you have all kinds of noise that can impact your working memory. And that the operational question is how many of your channels are open for the transmission of impressions or sensations or information from the outside. Starting at your left, we all have what's called a worry program. We all have about 8 to 10 consistent, repetitive things we worry about, whether it's body type or car payment or paying off our college loans or relationship issues or boss issues. These worries come out of U1, not out of U2. And remember that for most people, U1 is more powerful than U2. So all the time that you are aware, all of the time that you are awake, these worries keep popping up in your brain. And they take up, let's just simplify it and say, they take up one channel of however many channels you have. The second thing you have is what's called TUTs. We use King Tut's. TUT is task unrelated thoughts. You have 20 to 30,000 pop-ups in your brain per day. If all of you think about when you're aware of what's going on in your head, things just pop up. You don't ask them to pop up. They pop up automatically. Did you think about that? Did you remember to turn off the stove? Did you do all the things? Where are you going to park? Which turn? All of those things are TUTs, task unrelated thoughts. And those pop-ups are automatic. They take up a channel. Then to the right-hand side, you have UFOs, which are unidentifiable, fearful objects. Human beings have anxiety, stress, and tension that they deal with. Remember, we said that U1 is 50% inaccurate when it talks about threats. Threats don't also always come from the outside world. They also come from your internal thinking. So you also have a stream of threat interpretations just inside your own head. So those unidentified fearful objects keep popping up. And then you have another program in your brain, which is called your ANTS program, which is automatic negative thinking. You have a critic in your brain. Don't try that. Don't do that. Don't agree to speak in front of public as you know you won't do well. Don't wear that. People won't like it. Don't do that haircut, people. I mean, we have a constant critic in our head. And if you think of the purpose of the brain is to keep you from harm and threat, the way to do that is to talk you out of doing anything risky. So the U1 brain, through the ANTS program, the software in your brain, you have a little critic in your mind. It's whispering in your ear, don't try that. You're not going to be successful. Don't raise your hand. Put your head down so the professor doesn't call on you. Sit in the back. Don't make that comment in the staff meeting because people will think you're dumb. That's going on in your head all the time. So for most people, U1 is more powerful than U2. For most people, you lose 4 channels of clear communication of sensations and information that needs to come into your supercomputer so that you can do superior critical thinking, analytical thinking, problem solving, and decision making. So the second thing you need to learn in order to do what we're talking today is, number one, remember, is this bifurcation of the brain into U1, U2. The second thing is you have to keep your channels clear. You have to keep your channels noise-free in order to put your supercomputer to work. The issue then is something we call intentional or totally focused attention. That is, you must work constantly to keep your channels free of noise. And there is a technology to do that that we'll talk about. Automaticity is the fourth thing. Basically, over half of what anybody does is automatic. You don't think about it. Most people turn to the right when they come in a door they've never come in before. So if you think of the design of department stores or malls, you'll notice that a lot of the cheap sale merchandise is in stuff on the right-hand side because people have a natural tendency to turn right because we're right-handed. The theory of that is that our right hand is our weapon hand for everyone other than 10% of the population, so that if you were in a threat situation, turning to your right puts you in maximum combat mode, even though most of us are not carrying our sword going into Walmart or our AK-47. This is presented in a book that I'm going to recommend later calling Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman, also Herbert's book on second thought. Now, automaticity is automatic. Now, I say that, you think that's a funny thing to say, but that means therefore you're not aware of it. For the most part, you are not aware of what the U1 brain is doing to you. Most of us do not monitor U1. And that's the third lesson I want to teach you today. Your brain has an autopilot, has a built-in autopilot. It can reprogram itself without you having anything to do with it outside of awareness in your unconscious brain. It's almost as if we have a Tesla brain. It drives by itself. Doesn't require you to. It dreams by itself. It monitors threat by itself. It solves problems without you being aware it's working on it. You've seen this before. All of these words are what you would read: habituation, embedded routines, habits, heuristics, cruise control. That's all talking about automaticity. Now, the reason the brain has an automaticity program is that it's basically lazy. That is, it needs to be efficient. It only has 25 watts of energy to function with. And the more things it can make automatic, the more energy it has left to deal with unique situations. Things that are unique, different, creative, innovative, take more watts of energy for the brain to deal with than things that are habits. If you take bike riding, swimming, walking, all of the things that are now in your automatic program, you could not function in life if you had to rethink walking every time you walked. So if your upper brain had to say, okay, this is walking, I remember that, you lean a little bit forward to start kinetic momentum. You put one foot out to catch you from falling, and as you're doing that, you pivot your body forward, and then you have to bring the other. You couldn't function in life if you didn't have an automaticity program. Remembering the P300 and P500 on the bottom of that slide brings out again that your automatic brain is faster than your thinking brain. An automatic response will trigger before you have had time to think about it. That's why you do something that gets you in trouble later, because the U1 brain is faster than the U2 brain. And it'll have an automatic response before you have time to think. So again, the first learning is that there's a partition, not in the real brain, but in the metaphorical brain. Now for the weirdest part of this morning is that the goals of the lower brain, or the non-prefrontal cortex brain, what we're calling U1, and the goal of your awareness of the great things you're going to do in life and the legendary leader you're going to be are not always tightly aligned. That is, you have to understand that for most of us, We are aware of what U2 is doing. That is, I'm aware of my thinking that my prefrontal cortex is doing. But for the majority of us, the majority of our transactional life is being driven out of U1 that we are not monitoring and we're not thinking much about. So for most people, U1 is not always your friend. Most of the bad things you do that you have to pay for, that you regret later, you actually had no mental control over those things. They came out of your automaticity program. So when I ask you, why did you hit your boss in that meeting? And you say, I just wasn't thinking. Well, that's exactly what happened. Your U1 program hit your boss, not your U2 program. For that reason, there are a lot of books out there, and it's a very funny statement to make. That is, you are not your brain. You're not your kidney. You're not your bladder. You're not your appendix. You're not your stomach. You're also not your brain. Your brain is just one of 9 organs that runs the box. So there's no reason to believe that somehow yourself is identifiable with the brain, but you never talk about your kidney as being part of you. You have no control over your kidney. Very few of us get up in the morning and say, kidney, I would like to go to the bathroom about 10. If you could arrange that, because I've got an important meeting, so if you could just hold it back, that'd be good. We don't do that. We don't control the 9 organs that control our body. We don't control the U1 part of our brain. We can, but we don't. So you can read all of that is in You Are Not Your Brain by Schwartz. Now, if you look at leadership skills in the brain, we asked in the second slide, why the brain? Well, all of these things are things you'll see in the literature that have to do with what I'm talking about. A well-functioning U2 has a delay of gratification, emotional regulation. It pays attention to the count 10 rule. Self-control, patience, listening, free will, free choice, maturity, self-discipline, reflection, a careful pause. All of those things are what you need to do to stop U1 from doing something that you would later regret. For leaders, it's very simple. That is, you need to increase the ratio of voluntary intentional thought, which is the dominance of U2, over your automatic habitual U1 reactions. And most important, you have to understand and face the fact that you have a part of your brain that you are not now managing that causes you most of your suffering and most of your negative parts of your life and your career. So what's a leader to do? It turns out part of the process is physical. That is, it is unbelievably important to get sleep. And sleep is disturbed by your worry program, by your TUT program, by your ANTS program. So all of the noise and distraction that keeps you distracted during the day also gives you insomnia. Exercise from a brain standpoint is fundamental. It turns out there's 12 foods that you should eat that are brain foods, like blueberries, fish, almonds, walnuts. None of those are okay, but the avocado is the one I like. That's a brain food. Circadian rhythm, to pay attention to your natural rhythm and to reduce clutter and distractions from your life, are all things that would help a leader be more effective. The third thing I want to leave you with is mindfulness. It's a leadership skill. In order to use your brain more effectively, there's a whole technology coming on stream. Most high-level companies are beginning to teach mindfulness in their universities and their educational units. What I'm recommending is that you install a U3. So we've talked about U1 and U2. There's something else you need to know, and that is when U2 is operating, U2 gets turned off, and when U2 is operating, U1 gets turned off. So it's like a seesaw. You can only have U1 or U2 operating at one time. So if U1 is operating, you have to make some effort to bring U2 online. Now, I've been talking about you because I'm talking to you in the audience. If you're working on this yourself, you should change all this to me 1, me 2, and me 3. Because you're talking about yourself. And what I'm talking about is installing your CBO, which is your Chief Brain Officer. Mindfulness is a technology that's all over the place. Just go out on the internet and you'll get 20,000 hits for mindfulness. There's unlimited webcasts. There's unlimited books. If you're here in the Minneapolis-St. Paul area, we have a Buddhist institute that teaches mindfulness for free. So there's all kinds of things. So the 3-minute version is it's your Chief Brain Officer. Its techniques are to teach you to sense what me1 is doing and how to install a pause in not allowing U1 to do things that U2 will later regret. There's something called catch and release. That is, you have to monitor U1. You have to examine what U1 wants you to do. And U1 says, run that guy off the road because they cut in front of us. So run him off the road into the ditch. And then your U2 says, you know, that's really not a very good idea. There are all kinds of negative downstream consequences. So why don't we just relax, take a deep breath, and we're not going to do that. The research on mindfulness says you have to establish an internal dialogue between U1 and U2. And in order to do that, you have to name your parts. My U1 is Igor. For those of you who are no longer married or in a relationship, I recommend it's your ex that you use to name your bad part of yourself, U1. But in order to have your dialogue, and as weird as this sounds, if you start practicing brain improvement and your U1 does a pop-up or your ANTS program says, don't raise your hand, or your TUT program is throwing up unrelated thoughts into your working memory, you have to be able to say, Igor, I just noticed you had a pop-up there. I just noticed that you believe there's a threat. What exactly is the threat? Why do you think now that your boss doesn't like you, why do you think that comment was specifically related to you? Now that sounds like long, but these dialogues are half of a second long because it's doing it at brain speed. Oddly enough, when you start talking to Igor, by physical necessity, Igor has to trim down. Because as you bring U2 upstream, U1 downstreams. So it decreases the likelihood that U1's going to do something funny or bad. So what you have to do is you have to learn what U1 is doing. You have to learn what the auto brain is. Now, because we're talking about leadership and management, it also relates to you being able to read what other people's auto brains are doing. A lot of, probably more than half of the behavior that your direct reports and teammates do, they are not aware of any negative consequences of that action until later. That is, their U1 is what's sitting in the meeting. So when a subordinate does something that they are going to later regret, you as a boss have to understand that that's what happened. So when you're debriefing that event, saying, you know, what you said in that meeting was very disruptive, to which the person you're talking to will say, I wasn't thinking. Well, yes, U2 was not functioning. But because I'm a mindful leader. Let me tell you how to manage that in the future. What you need to do is you need to review first what goes out to your printer. So when your computer program sends out something to say on your printer, you need to look at it first before you hit the print button. So it's called a reflective pause, takes half a second, no big deal. So you need to teach mindfulness. So when you're looking at what your auto brain does, you need to figure out what it's going to do, figure out what a better move is. So the third thing is I recommend a Me3, which you can call your chief brain officer. I want you to learn about mindfulness. I want you to be a brain smart manager or leader. And then if you're at all interested in this, there's 3 books. You need to read them in this sequence. The first one is Thinking Fast and Slow by Dan Kahneman, which is a great introduction to this bi-brain view. A little bit more technical is David Rock's Your Brain at Work, a little deeper. Do not read the third book until you've read the first 2. The third book might destroy your life if you're not prepared for it. But the third book is called The Untethered Soul by Singer. You'll have to read it 4 times to understand it. It has changed my life. It has changed a lot of people I've worked with. It is a phenomenal piece of work, but don't read it until you've read a couple introductory things so you can understand it. So with that, for some of you out there, hopefully your life and career can change for the better. I will switch over to chat and some questions.
Great. Thank you, Bob Eichinger. Always thought-provoking. I do have a couple questions. I'm going to honor our time, so I'm just going to ask a few.
All right.
The first question is mindfulness a new leadership construct, and how is it different from self-awareness?
Self-awareness is a piece of mindfulness. And I mean, mindfulness has been with us since the beginning of humankind. Mindfulness is the term we put on it now. It has its recent origins in the Buddha. So it comes from Buddhist origins, but it can be a secular version. That is, Buddhism, of course, has sort of a spiritual piece to it. I find when I teach mindfulness in companies, they're not so interested in the spiritual piece of it. But, you know, compassion and helping the suffering and all that is great stuff. But in the C-suite, they're not interested in that. So there's a secular version of mindfulness. John Kabat-Zinn is sort of the major proponent here in the United States of that version or that wing of mindfulness. So it's just the most recent term we attach to something that's been around for a long time. I'm sure Socrates wrote about it.
Great. Thank you. How does someone's natural propensity towards optimism or negativity impact ability to change or improve neuroplasticity?
There's 2 issues. We are born with a predisposition. So in that half of a billionth of a second when you form, your brain structure and the wiring and the chemistry and the electrical system will either have an optimistic bent or a pessimistic bent. So people are born optimistic and pessimistic. So if you're going to be mindfulness, first of all, you have to understand yourself. That's where self-awareness comes in. Am I naturally optimistic? Am I naturally pessimistic? If you're naturally pessimistic, that means you have a very active ANTS program, which is the automatic negative thinking. So that little devil's going to be in your ear saying, don't try that, don't raise your hand, don't make a comment. Divert your glance so the professor doesn't pick you to comment. All of that stuff will be in your ear. So the second issue is recognizing which of those 2 you are. And then there's all kinds of techniques to make you different. So I particularly work with shy people, introverts, in the area of making presentations, because talking in front of people is evaluated as actually ahead of death as a fear in life. So we've got a very active ANTS program with public speaking. And you can become a public speaker as a shy introvert through practice and other techniques. So figure out who you are, take a look at tracking it, and then try it, change it over time.
Great. Well, on behalf of St. Thomas, I want to thank you for joining us today. We will be sending out the slides as well as a link to the presentation today. Our next online learning series, and maybe it will be spring by then, is on St. Patrick's Day, Multicultural Marketing with Professor Nikisha Lewis. I hope you join us then. Thanks for coming and spending some time with us. And
Live long and prosper.
live long and prosper.